Listed. Call us for a free consultation. If you don't,
they might be correct. What America can do is hold those high who are trying to make their societies more equitable, more just, and more democratic, and to push back against those who don't. And when the breaches are of a magnitude that NATO and the EU and the G7 and the G20 struggle with what to do, the American president can speak for the entire democratic world. That's what Joe Biden did yesterday when he said of Putin, the guy's got to go. The White House says it was an unscripted moment with Joe Biden. All the best ones are with him. I think he said what he meant, and if he did mean to say it, he was right and should stick to it. Democracy isn't this halfway thing. Ukraine has it. Russia's trying to invade it and crush it, like Russia has done so many times before in so many places. It's time for this to stop, and it's time for this type of thing to stop all around the world. And it's time for the U.S. to make making it stop its business. Joe Biden is in the right place on this one.
Right now, the big switch is happening across.
Attention, you bet. The all-new X8.
It was 1.1% of the deleted comments that actually violated Danish law. We also found that of what's being kept up, it was less than 0.006% of comments that had been, designated as hate speech that actually violated Danish laws. And I think that's, that type of research and looking at it in that way is an important antidote to sort of the message that a lot of European politicians are pushing, that basically the platforms are flooded with illegal content. I'm not going to say that our research is exhaustive, but I think it suggests very much that this is actually not the case. And then, should Facebook tinker? I think that's
a safe place to live anywhere in America as far as a business.
It's an entire administration of thousands of people that are executing his political direction. Of course, then there's hundreds of thousands of government employees below that are taking their guidance and their leadership from the politically duly elected administration that's in power right now. So you're right, it's one individual, but a very powerful and very influential one on how the government is making millions of decisions every day. And then, of course, there's the folks that are our competitors, our adversaries, and our allies that look and hang on every word that our president says. And that's unfortunate because, as I said earlier, I mean, the speech and the messages that he's made when he was in Europe were confusing, to be kind. So I would say it's not just weakness, it's actually some very misguided policies that he's made. And I would stress that the war in Ukraine didn't start on the 24th of February. It actually starts about a year ago. And that was when Putin started doing a series of exercises where he postured his forces. He demonstrated and he exercised one of the largest amphibious demonstrations and exercises in Kerch, which is in Crimea, annexed territory, in March of last year. And much of those forces came out of the Caspian Sea. They started moving from other parts around the world, and he started massing his military and building up all of the equipment that he would need to launch this invasion. Throughout that time, there had not been any private or movement of military forces. Again, these are things that if you look at and you track, you don't have to actually see a public affairs announcement of it to actually know what is or isn't happening. But there hadn't been any change of disposition of our forces in Europe to signal that we were aware or that we were going to ensure and bolster NATO's Eastern Front. So the signals that he was sending from a year ago were one of, at best, we're just going to ignore what Putin was going to do there, would basically let him have a free move. And then there was, as you fast forward to about the month or two before the invasion, you had statements that sanctions would deter, but then they wouldn't be implemented until after he invaded, which seemed wrong-headed to me. And then there was the unfortunate press brief just days before the invasion, where a little incursion would probably not elicit the same reaction as a large one. The message needed to be much more clear, much more explicit. Diplomacy only works when you have a military behind it, and also diplomacy only works when you are clear and explicit in your language. And we haven't been executing that very well. So it's not that he's not a strong leader, it's that he's been executing on policies that are wrong-headed in my mind.
Let's go back to our phone lines and let's talk to Mark, who's calling from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, on the Democrat line. Mark, good morning.
Hello, good morning, and as always, thanks for Washington Journal and C-SPAN. You sit here listening to all the other conversations while you're on the phone, and it tends to get you going from one direction to the other, and then what you originally called up about, maybe you might want to change your thoughts. But I thought maybe the main gist that I want to make after having listened to these guys is when you have a panel like this on Washington Journal, I always like to see it because you figure one's from one side, one's from the other side, and you're going to get different point of views. But I think Washington Journal needs to do a little bit better research on these things because everybody in the world knows that Heritage Foundation is funded and run by the Cox or the remaining Cox brother. So then, naturally, you expect to hear from the Defense Priorities Foundation will be coming from the other side. Guess what? Guess who started and funded the Defense Priorities Foundation? It's the Cox. So anyway, that's why these guys, even though they sound slightly different in different things like how much money to spend on the military and all that, they still kind of sound the same as far as that sort of thing. And here's the real kicker to that thing. Ask both these guys, how do they feel about Koch Industries? Right now they're in a big to-do about they are staying in Russia and they're backing groups opposing U.S. sanctions. I'm almost left speechless here. But for the Navy man that was really just attacking President Biden just before I got through here, he's wiped it off now. But has anybody else noticed his upper lip is always sweaty during this entire thing?
Well, we'll just cut him off right there. So first of all, I'll rephrase this question and ask the two of you, what do you think about American companies that continue to operate in Russia right now, despite sanctions being called for by the United States and NATO? And we'll start with you, Ben.
Well, I think it's, number one, it's up to companies what they want to do in Russia, and insofar as they're complying with the law. So obviously, if they're breaking the law and continuing to operate in Russia, they shouldn't do that. But we have sanctions. That's our policy. And so companies shouldn't violate that. And look, if they want to do business in Russia and take the risk of being boycotted or punished by consumers, I think that's they're right. And what I would say in response to the caller is you can look at everything I've ever written about defense spending and U.S. foreign policy is, with all due respect to Brent, almost entirely opposed to what the Heritage Foundation would say. So I am an advocate of realism and restraint, of a smaller and more peaceful U.S. foreign policy. So, there's a pretty big difference between the sides here. And I think my opinions on this are not drawn from who writes checks to defense priorities, but rather my own experience on this subject. And for example, look, I think that Brent's wrong and that Biden didn't do anything in terms of being overly weak to provoke this attack on Ukraine. In fact, the United States was doing military exercises that were upsetting and even arguably frightening to Russia a lot in the run-up to this war. We increased the pace and size of military exercises with Ukraine, which was not great in terms of the way the Russians thought about Ukraine. We signed a cooperation agreement in November 2021 with Ukraine that said that Ukraine still might eventually join NATO, which I think was a terrible mistake. You know, Bill Burns, who's now the head of the CIA, when he was ambassador to Russia under Obama, said the brightest of all red lines for the Russians, the Russian elite, not just Putin, the brightest of all red lines is Ukraine joining NATO. So, you could say that it's unjust. You can say that it's immoral for for the Russians to be angered and violent towards that outcome. But you cannot say that it's surprising. The Russians have been pretty clear about the idea of Ukraine joining NATO being anathema to them. And so I think we have to be clear-headed and practical about it and say, let's not do things, even if they feel good morally, like putting Ukraine in NATO, that are just going to make everything worse. Or worse yet, say we might put Ukraine in NATO but not actually defend it. So I think that was a disastrous policy that the United States had, and one that I'd be highly critical of this administration, the last administration, the Trump administration, and the Obama administration, going all the way back for setting this up and for holding the door opened, NATO's door open to Ukraine.
Brett?
Well, I guess just first off, I'll just defend myself, and like Ben also, you can access everything that I've written, at least since I left the military just a little over a year and a half ago. Definitely not partisan, conservative, but again, I tend to want to make sure that I go and I find the facts, and then I'll go where the facts lead me. And no matter who is paying my check, quite frankly, and I've never had any kind of lead or being constrained by where those facts lead me, what my recommendations or what my position is. And that's a good thing, I think, to challenge assumptions wherever they are, left, right, in the middle. You should always be updating and challenging assumptions. And I welcome the discourse and debate from those that don't agree with me, because I learned from that, and you get to better policies and a better position. So on that point, as far as I will defend also Heritage Foundation as well. The vast majority of the money that comes to Heritage is from small donations. It's not from any one or two large donors. And the Kochs have a long history, and it's very thanked. It goes back to the foundation of it. But again, Heritage is much larger, much more diverse, doesn't take any government funding, nor any funding from any defense industry with strings attached to say, please do the following studies. So that's Heritage. As far as Ben's points, just to reiterate, is you need to understand your competitors better. The reasons that we have bad policies that are being taken by the Biden administration, again, it's not just him, but he is the one responsible as the president and commander-in-chief, is that you need to understand. It's not empathizing, but you have to guard against mirroring American constructs and ideas and notions onto someone that's wholly foreign. So we need to do a better job of that. And when I say that we should expand NATO, that we need more defense spending, it comes with a deeper appreciation of what you're trying to do and how to do it in the smartest way. I'd have to say we didn't understand Russia. We didn't understand Russians in 2014 in Ukraine and Crimea the first time. We didn't understand them in Georgia. We still don't fully have an appreciation. But I will say from this point forward, the dynamic of Russian people and the Russian government is very, very different from once this invasion started. The assumptions and the worldview of Russian people is shaken to its core because of the close affinity and cultural history they have with the Ukrainian people. They're not going to go back to where they were before, not in this lifetime, likely. Far too many people have died, and there's been far too much violence and destruction in Ukraine. So there's a new world in Europe that we have to be ready for and embrace. And hopefully, there are smarter people that are in the administration that think about how to get ahead of that and to shape it to the best interest of the United States.
Let's talk to
our system. Thursday, where some of these storms could also be rather nasty as well, especially damaging winds and some hail potential as well. So we need to basically give you a heads up for the entire week, Reynolds. We are going to be busy yet again.
Yes, that's a look going forward, but a look at the past shows you what has happened in terms of our, well, the severe weather record of severe.
Of spiritual warfare.
Yeah! I'm prepared to face whatever challenges might lie ahead. I'm Paul Tenhaken, asking for your support to help keep Sioux Falls safe and strong.
Probably risking our lives, but we don't think about it at all. We love our work. Our final high this week goes to a group of elementary school students and their teachers back here in the United States who surprised their Ukrainian-born custodian with a show of solidarity.
This is really... Good morning, honey. Thank you, thank you.
The walls covered in sunflowers for Miss Lana. The sunflower is Ukraine's national flower and a symbol of hope. Lana Gazenko has worked at Oak Hill Elementary School in Covington, Georgia for the last 21 years, and she has dozens of relatives still living in Ukraine. School staff, which also organized a celebration when Miss Lana became a United States citizen, say news of the Russian invasion has been traumatic for their beloved co-worker, of course, so they wanted to find a creative way to show their support. Through tears, Miss Lana said the surprise left her speechless. Nicely done, Oak Hill Elementary. We'll be right back with your Sunday mugshots.
Primary, and then Donald Trump will be a huge embarrassment for Trump.
Raises the question about his juice. I mean, is he picking the right horses in these races?
I mean, I think there were questions about was he ever picking the right candidates from the get-go. But I mean, in Georgia, if you look at things, I mean, it's a challenge to go against any incumbent when, by most accounts, Brian Kemp, the governor there in Georgia, has done things that Republicans and conservatives are happy with. They are pleased with how he has governed. And so the issue there in Georgia is that David Perdue was always, facing an uphill challenge against an incumbent governor. Right. I think the bigger question to me, though, is that who former President Donald Trump endorses is very different than if Trump himself chooses to run again, because he has always been the person that rallies parts of the Republican base, not the people he endorses.
Right. I mean, is there any concern that, Trump is really jeopardizing Republicans' chances?
Look, I think in some of these campaigns, if he pushes forward a candidate who would have a hard time winning the general, it could cause problems. I think the view generally, Abby, on the right is the wind's at their back. There's going to be a backlash to President Biden, and that this is going to be a good year to be a Republican. But look, we all covered 2010, and we recall that candidates do matter. And if you get behind a candidate, even in a good year for your party, who is, not acceptable in the general election, that candidate could still lose.
Well, we'll leave it there. Thank you all for being here this Sunday morning, and thank you for being here at home. That's it for Inside Politics Sunday. Don't forget, you can also listen to our podcast. Download Inside Politics wherever you get your podcasts. Just scan that QR code at the bottom of your screen. But stick with us. Coming up next, State of the Union with Jake Tapper and Dana Bash. Dana's guests this morning include Senators Cory Booker and Jim Risch. Thank you again for sharing your Sunday morning with us. Have a great rest of your day.
Having a 5G phone.
Day with that rain and, yes, even some snow sticking around, or at least attempting to, as we head into Thursday morning. Then the European model comes around and has a similar looking solution, so we are at least getting some consistency in place. The X factor is going to be twofold. One, what kind of moisture do we have left over later Wednesday into Thursday? And two, what kind of cold air are we going to have in place? Those details will be ironed out as we head closer to that midweek outlook. But regardless, we at least do have that chance to get appreciable moisture in place for the first time in a little while across a decent portion of the area. So keep an eye out for updates. We'll also watch as temperatures are a little on the chilly side for the start of April before trying to moderate afterward. Highs today in the 30s and 40s East River, 50s to near 60 out west, with another split along the river tonight for overnight lows, 20 east, 30s out west. Your 7-day forecast peaks on Monday for temperatures in many areas, though Sioux Falls may try and nudge up toward 50 on Tuesday ahead of that cold front before we keep an eye on that chance for rain and snow Tuesday night through Wednesday. Next weekend, for what it's worth, looks dry. Same for Aberdeen, right down to the chance at rain and snow Tuesday and
If you or your family ever had major
entry into NATO, because every existing member nation, there are 30 now, must agree to accept the new membership. The treaty says any decision on enlargement must be made by unanimous agreement. The NATO treaty also states that every sovereign nation has the right to choose its own security arrangement. So NATO membership is not imposed on countries and allies, and they have the right to leave should they wish to. No nation has ever opted out of NATO. And as for Ukraine, NATO welcomed its bid for membership in 2008. The alliance pledged that Ukraine would eventually become a member, but definitive timelines were never worked out. Public Western support for Ukraine's membership has grown over the years, but some NATO members remain worried about the ongoing unrest and corruption in the country, dating back far earlier than this year. And some countries have been concerned about the consequences of threats from Russia about NATO expansion. Technically, Ukraine shouldn't need to be in NATO to have security assurances from certain Western countries. Back in 1994, Ukraine, Russia, the U.S., and the U.K. signed something called the Budapest Memorandum. Ukraine agreed to relinquish its nuclear arsenal, which was the world's third largest at the time, in exchange for security assurances from the United States and the United Kingdom. All four countries agreed to, quote, respect the independence and sovereignty and the existing borders of Ukraine and to refrain from the threat or use of force against the country. Putin's invasion of Ukraine is a direct violation of that Budapest Memorandum. All right, we're going to take a break. Don't go anywhere. When we come back, my conversation with America's former ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, another special hour of Velshi from Warsaw, Poland after this. Good morning. It's Sunday, March 27th. It's 9 a.m. here in New York, 2 p.m. here in Warsaw, Poland. Just down the road, a few minutes walk from where I am, is the Royal Castle, a centuries-old Polish landmark where President Biden delivered a forceful speech less than 24 hours ago about Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. It was the last stop of his European trip, and it was a momentous one. Before a large audience that included Ukrainian refugees and Polish citizens and government officials, President Biden invoked important Polish world figures like Pope John Paul II and the former Polish president and Nobel Peace Prize winner Lech Walesa to draw a contrast between the brutal actions of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Most of all, it was a speech that championed democracy and condemned Putin's iron-fisted dictatorship.
There's simply no justification or provocation for Russia's choice of war. A dictator bent on rebuilding an empire will never erase the people's love for liberty. Brutality will never grind down their will to be free. Ukraine will never be a victory for Russia.
But it was an ad-libbed line at the very end of his speech that that caught my attention.
We will have a different future, a brighter future, rooted in democracy and principles, hope and light, of decency and dignity, of freedom and possibilities. For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power.
Almost immediately after the president left the stage, White House officials walked back his statement to clarify that the president wasn't calling for regime change. Rather, it was to emphasize the point that, quote, Putin cannot be allowed to exercise power over his neighbors. Secretary of State Blinken once again reiterated that message earlier during a news conference in Jerusalem where he's attending an Israeli Arab summit. But the Kremlin was quick to point out that President Biden's remarks yesterday, quote, are not for Biden to decide. President Biden's disdain for Vladimir Putin's cruelty is no secret. He's made his opinion of the Russian president very clear throughout this trip. Earlier in the day, while touring the PGE National Stadium here in Warsaw to meet with refugees and their helpers, Biden called Putin, quote, a butcher. Earlier this week, he once again called Putin a war criminal. President Biden delivered his speech just a few hours after Russia launched a pair of high-precision cruise missiles on Lviv, a city in western Ukraine, roughly 40 miles from its border with Poland. Those strikes reportedly hit an industrial factory and an oil facility connected to the Ukrainian military, injuring at least 5 people. It ignited a larger fire that caused plumes of thick black smoke to cover the skies over Lviv. And in light of those new attacks by Russia, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy renewed his calls for help defending Ukraine's airspace, including a no-fly zone. While Ukraine's defiant military and citizens continue to succeed in holding off Russian forces in some parts of the country, the Ukrainian people continue to be terrorized and driven out of their homes. As of today, more than 3.8 million people have left the country, and more than 1,000 civilians have been killed. That's according to the UN Human Rights Office. NBC's Jacob Soboroff joins me now from Lviv, Ukraine. Jacob, you were on the air with us 24 hours ago when the first of 2 strikes hit Lviv. What's the situation there? I noticed that behind you, people are out there enjoying a sort of sunny Sunday afternoon.
Yeah, Ali, you mentioned that the Ukrainian people have been terrorized and driven from their homes all throughout this nation. Millions of people have become internally displaced. Millions of people have become refugees crossing the border into those, past the eastern border of those NATO countries. But here in Lviv, despite these two attacks that shattered what was a sense of safety and security in the second largest city in the country, here in the western part of this nation, people are still here. People are remaining defiant. On the left-hand side of your screen, you're looking at pictures of what I saw firsthand with my own eyes last night, the Russian attack on that fuel depot, designed to do exactly as you said, terrorize the people of this nation and also cripple the infrastructure of the military. It was a facility, according to a local official, regional military official, used by the Ukrainian military for exactly what it looked like, fuel. To the south of where I'm sitting right now, that second strike was used as a repair facility, a maintenance facility for other types of Ukrainian military infrastructure. But here in Lviv, people remain defiant, people remain out on the streets, and I think what people are asking today is what next? There's still critical infrastructure. You're looking again at the left-hand side of your screen, picture from yesterday of that TV tower, the TV tower that remains behind me right now. There are other pieces of critical infrastructure. I think people are here worried about potentially the Russians going after, but you don't see people leaving in droves because you don't see the type of attack, at least not to this point, on civilians you've seen in places like Mariupol, where the humanitarian missions that are largely based out of this part of the country are having trouble getting to in order to deliver much needed supplies. So a lot of questions here on the ground in Lviv, and people are trying to maintain some sense of normalcy in their day-to-day lives.
Putin needs to go. Only undoing everything else that he said, undoing every other aspect of the trip, and just piling confusion onto a situation with if it needs one thing right now, if Zelenskyy needs one thing, it's clarity. Yes. On what the actual next step are, so that other things can happen after that, whether it's winning the war, whether it's suing for peace, whether it's all of the things that come from that. But when you're creating more discord and Russia's using it as propaganda, you only make the situation worse. And that's got to be what the White House was thinking when they were back on Air Force One, flying back to the United States. Here we are, back at square one after trying to make it better.
Right. I think a lot of people were hoping that maybe he would come and with his leadership skills, maybe, you know, bring about some peace negotiation, move this thing, bring this war to a close. You brought up some of the gaffes. Here's a montage of some of these gaffes, Pete.
Ukrainian people have a lot of backbone. They have a lot of guts, and I'm sure you're observing it. And you're going to see when you're there. But as I've made clear, American forces are in Europe, not in Europe, to engage in conflict with Russian forces. American forces are here to defend NATO allies.
If chemical weapons were used in Ukraine, would that trigger a military response from NATO?
It would trigger a response in kind.
The United States has no intention of using chemical weapons, period, under any circumstances.
I did not say that, in fact, the sanctions would deter him. Sanctions never deter.
The purpose of the sanctions has always been and continues to be deterrence.
So before we move on, I just really quick want to just mention this whole total, mask one day, inside, outside. I mean, it just is beyond the fact that it doesn't make any scientific sense at all. It just projects weakness at a time where we already have a problem with that in this administration. Let's put that aside for.
Man, I have orders to fill. Eve, you have to go hunting for me.
It's going to be one of 9. It's going to be working with these people on a daily basis. And I think if anybody should have input into who gets into their group, you might say, it should be the justices themselves, not the political people who want to sway a court one way or the other. And I don't think that's where the justices really lie. And if you could give me a few seconds, I'd like to listen for any response. But if I get a response, it would have to be a few seconds later because of the delay between here and the East Coast. Thank you.
Let's go to Tom, who's calling from Erie, Pennsylvania, on the independent line. Tom, good morning.
Good morning. I noticed that when there was a woman who called in during your last segment and she challenged both of the guests you had on about their feeling about the last election. And I think that the guy from the Heritage Foundation told us all we needed to know. He could not bring himself to say that that President Biden was elected in a legitimate election. You know, he used he skirted the issue the way anybody from the Heritage Foundation normally would. And I want to say that I agree with the woman that C-SPAN fell down in who they were choosing to talk about this issue. You had people that were negative about the current administration from both sides of the argument, and that's just not right. The other thing I wanted to say was this current controversy going on about about Clarence Thomas and his wife. I think people don't realize the gravity of that situation. Clarence Thomas should be impeached, and I think that anybody who doesn't recognize that is only because they don't want to.
The caller brought up the recent story involving Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas and his wife, Virginia Thomas, and the January 6th insurrection. There's a story about this in the Washington Post, and I'll read a couple of paragraphs to you. Virginia Thomas, a conservative activist married to Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, repeatedly pressed White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows to pursue unrelenting efforts to overturn the 2020 presidential election in a series of urgent text messages in the critical weeks after the vote, according to copies of the messages obtained by the Washington Post and CBS News. The messages, 29 in all, reveal an extraordinary pipeline between Virginia Thomas, who goes by Jenny, and President Donald Trump's top aide during a period when Trump and his allies were vowing to go to the Supreme Court in an effort to negate the election results. On November 10th, after news organization had projected Joe Biden the winner based on state vote totals, Thomas wrote to Meadows, "Help this great president stand firm, Mark. You are the leader with him who is standing for America's constitutional governance at the precipice. The majority knows Biden and the left is attempting the greatest heist of our history." Once again, that's coming from the Washington Post story. Virginia Thomas urged White House chief to pursue unrelenting efforts to overturn the 2020 election, text show. Let's go back.
Latitude here to push Putin a little harder by maybe just giving those MiGs to Ukraine.
Well, first of all, let me say that the NATO alliance and the United States bilaterally is in constant contact with President Zelenskyy and members of his cabinet. We are constantly in conversation with the Ukrainians, assessing what their defense needs are. Since President Biden came into office in January of last year, the United States has provided $2 billion of lethal assistance to Ukraine. Now, on your question about the MiGs, we have urged every ally in the alliance to come forward and share their ideas on what more we can do to support Ukraine through anti-air and anti-armor weapons and other ideas. Poland came forward with the idea of offering the Soviet-era jets. We looked at that. We had some questions about it. And at the end of the day, the United States believed that in this case, the delivery of those jets was untenable. We had a number of questions about the logistics of delivering those jets from Poland to Ukraine. We also had questions about the Ukrainian pilots that could potentially be flying those jets. But this is an evolving set of circumstances. We are continually coming together with our allies and looking at what more we can do to get lethal assistance in the hands of the Ukrainian military.
You say that the issue with the MiGs is mostly logistical, but here in the United States, the administration has said, no, it's a question of escalation. And if I'm not mistaken, the original idea of Poland giving the MiGs to Ukraine was an American idea. It was only when the Poles said, look, we'll give them to you, then you can give them to Ukraine, that it became a problem.
Well, my understanding is that the Ukrainians actually asked Poland. In fact, I believe that the Ukrainians are in regular contact, as they are with the United States, with individual NATO allies. They've spoken with most of the allies on NATO's eastern flank, and even some that are not on NATO's eastern flank over towards the west.
Yeah.
Each ally is doing what it can to provide assistance in this moment, and we will continue to work with allies on determining what's best and how we can assist them with, again, their air defense needs.
There was a debate, Madam Ambassador, in the administration as to exactly what sanctions were designed to do. We were told in the run-up to this invasion that sanctions were meant to deter Putin from ever going into Ukraine. But on the weekend, the president said that no, sanctions were never meant to deter. Let's listen to what the president said and listen to what his lieutenant said in the run-up to the invasion.
Let's get something straight. You remember, if you covered me from the very beginning, I did not say that, in fact, the sanctions would deter him. Sanctions never deter.
The president believes that sanctions are intended to deter.
The purpose of the sanctions has always been and continues to be deterrence.
The purpose of the sanctions, in the first instance, is to try to deter Russia from going to war.
Sanctions are not an end to themselves. They serve a higher purpose. And that purpose is to deter and prevent.
We do see them as having a deterrent impact.
So, Madam Ambassador, can you clear this up for us? Were they meant to deter or were they not meant to deter?
So look, before Russia went into Ukraine, we took a number of steps to outline the consequences that Russia would be facing if they'd opted for a war inside Ukraine. We laid out a sanctions package. We made it clear that we were in daily contact with our European allies to put together a package. Now that Russia has gone into Ukraine, we've moved forward with those costs. They've been unprecedented. And if you look at any indicator for the Russian economy, whether you're looking at the value of the ruble or you're looking at their credit rating or you're looking at interest rates, those sanctions are having an impact right now on the Russian economy.
But again, were they meant to deter or not?
Well, look, before the war, obviously, we were laying out the consequences in pretty explicit detail with the hope that President Putin would take an alternative course. We were trying in that moment to sharpen his choice. We were also, at that moment, moving U.S. force posture into Eastern Europe, also to help sharpen his choice. Unfortunately, he opted for war, and now he's feeling the consequences.
One last quick question, if I could, in the just remaining time we have left here. Russia appears to be recalibrating, saying that it's going to be focusing on consolidating its defense of Donetsk and Luhansk in the Donbass region. Is there an opportunity here to try to save the rest of Ukraine?
Well, let's be clear, this war is not going as planned. The information we had indicated that the Russians wanted to go in and take Kyiv in just a few days. It's a month now into this war. They're in a defensive crouch outside of Kyiv. They have announced that they're changing their tactics. We'll have to monitor the situation on the ground and see if that's actually the case. But I think they are on their back foot here, and we've been so impressed with the fighting capability and spirit of the Ukrainian forces, and we have confidence that they're going to prevail.
The Ukrainian forces certainly are the one remarkable thing about all of this. Julianne Smith, the ambassador to NATO for the United States, thanks so much for your time today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Up next, Senator Rick Scott on the president's speech and the challenges ahead in Ukraine.
Fox News Sunday is brought to you by Pacific Life. Over 150 years of strength and stability. Confidence in every step of your journey.
He were bug side.
To do it now, and we need to do it with our NATO allies. Recall we did this in Syria and did not honor the red line. This time we got to be darn sure that what we're doing is something that will be backed up by us, by our NATO allies. And I do think that's a red line. I think chemical and biological weapons must be.
Do you believe the response, I hear the words proportionate. Define what proportionate in your mind would be.
Well, the president said that we would respond in kind, and later that was walked back because it sounded like he was saying, of course, we would respond with chemical weapons, which would not be appropriate. Right. We've actually signed a treaty saying we would never do that, as has Russia, by the way. So our response should be militarily. And I don't think we need to spell it out exactly, but there are a number of military responses that I could see. One would be to establish a humanitarian air defense zone in parts of western Ukraine. And that could be done from outside of the borders of Ukraine. That's an example where in Lviv, where you have thousands of people who are there with the international relief organizations, lots of reporters, including from NBC, lots of refugees coming through, hundreds of thousands there. Yesterday, there was a bombing of Lviv within a couple miles of the train station where there's so many refugees and so many of these Westerners. So we could, through some means, since we have Patriot missiles in Poland, in Romania, in Slovakia, protect some of that territory. That's an example of something that could be done militarily that would not be offensive, strictly defensive, no boots on the ground, but would enable us to say use of chemical weapons or biological weapons has consequences, and we're going to do something about it.
Let me turn to some domestic issues here. The Supreme Court. Have you made a decision on whether you're going to support Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson's elevation to the Supreme Court?
Well, I said all along I'm going to wait till the Judiciary Committee is done with this action. I think they're going to vote a week from Monday. They've still asked for additional documents, the Republicans on the committee, so I want to give her that ability. But as you know, Chuck, less than a year ago I voted against her for the Court of Appeals, and I did so because I'm concerned about her judicial philosophy. In particular, for me, on the regulatory front, she had a case at the district court level where essentially she legislated from the bench and had to do with country of origin labeling for meat products, and she did what many of us think is wrong, which is say that the statute says one thing, but we're going to, as judges, decide what's best. And so that's my biggest concern. I talked to her about it. I've also talked to her about the court packing issue, which does concern me. Her mentor, Justice Breyer, as well as Justice Ginsburg, both came out against packing the court because of the interest in defending the institution of the court, and yet she refuses to do that. And I don't understand that because it's not an issue that will come before her in the court, so she should, as a nominee, be able to talk about it, and I'm concerned that she's not been willing to do that.
I'm curious, I want to play a clip of some of the questioning she received from some of your Republican colleagues on the committee hearing. Here's the clip.
You say this does not signal a heinous or egregious child pornography offense. Help me understand that.
Do you agree with this book that is being taught with kids that babies are racist?
The ordinary crime was not committed by computer. So the
Would you now agree with me that computers are sort of the venue of choice for child pornographer people?
Senator Mitt Romney thought some of the tone of the questioning and the topics were sort of off key there. I'm curious what you thought.
Well, her record is fair game, Chuck, and this is not attacking her personally. By the way, I found her bright and personable when I met with her. She's obviously an historic choice for the court. But I don't think it's wrong to go after her record. I mean, that's what we should be doing in these hearings. With Justice Kavanaugh, as you know, it became personal attacks. By the way, uncorroborated attacks. It was not about his record, largely. This is about her record, and it's about her sentencing. It's not probably what I'm going to base my decision on, because I think there are a lot of judges that have very lenient sentencing these days. I do think at a time of rising crime, particularly in our major cities, that's an issue. And she was below the recommendations based on the federal sentencing guidelines, and also below, in some cases, what the probation officers recommended. So I think it's fair to ask about that. I think it should be done in a respectful way. And again, I'm glad that these were not personal attacks on her, which we have seen in previous
Senator, I'm curious,
nominations, including Judge Kavanaugh.
I'm curious if you believe Justice Thomas, these text messages that have come out from Ginny Thomas to the former White House Chief of Staff, saying some bizarre conspiratorial things. It's not against the law to believe in conspiratorial things. But I'm curious, given the precedent that Loretta Lynch, as Attorney General, when she recused herself after a tarmac meeting with former President Clinton, when the Justice Department was looking into something involving Hillary Clinton, is that a precedent Justice Thomas should follow and recuse himself on January 6 cases?
Well, I would respect his opinion on that. I don't know that he'll have the specific issue come before him about those records. That might be one where he would consider that. But look, he's a jurist who has a lot of integrity, and I think he will make that decision. I don't think that what your spouse says should recuse you from, whether it's in the legislative branch or in the judicial branch. That would be a new precedent. But I do think that if a case comes before him that's exactly on point, again, as to probably records and whether they should be made available, that might be an issue where he would think about it. But look, he's going to make that decision, and he has the right to do it.
Senator Rob Portman, Republican from Ohio, I always appreciate you coming on and sharing your perspective with us, sir. Thank you.
Thanks, Chuck. Thanks for having me.
You got it. Coming up, I'm going to talk a little bit more about those Supreme Court hearings with Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson and the unusually aggressive questioning she faced. Senator Cory Booker will appear when we return.
Treatments and cures. To say, we want you to help curate this exhibit. Did you think to yourself, I'm not qualified to do that? Right.
Yeah, definitely. Right. Yeah. Because there's a clear separation of every other department and museum versus security. So we were very intimidated at first. But look where we are at now.
Of course, getting to where they are now took months of preparation. The team oversaw every detail along the way, from the wall color to the works of art. Each participant selected pieces from the museum's permanent collection that spoke to them personally.
Black over reds.
Koo chose paintings by Philip Guston and Mark Rothko.
It kind of affects you in a really deep emotional way, and I wanted to see how other visitors would react to that.
So now that it's up on the wall, this is still the one that you wanted up here. No regrets, right?
No regrets, no regrets. I'm very proud of this piece, as if I did it myself.
Archibald Frederick selected a more contemporary piece, Mickalene Thomas's Resist No. 2, a collage of racial protests.
There's so much going on in the world, in this country, as far as all the turmoil and social injustice, that this is speaking to everything that I wanted to say.
Guards spend more time with the art than anyone in the museum. They're around it day and night, looking at it, observing it.
Board of Trustee member Amy Elias came up with the idea for the exhibit, along with the museum's head curator, Usman Naeem.
It's a simple idea, but it's asking profound questions. Who is art for? What are museums for? Who gets to talk about art? This show overall is telegraphing to the public, art is for everyone.
A reminder to museum goers everywhere that if you have questions about art, look no further than the person standing next to it.
And for other visitors who come here, now that we've done this, they will see us totally in a different light.
You're no longer a shadow?
No. No longer. No longer.
I 30-day risk-free trial. You can
still reach out and do that and sort of knock on Poland's door. As you reported, hundreds of thousands of refugees have flowed west throughout Ukraine to Lviv, and so kind of had seen this as a safe place. And so this is Putin's ability to show that no place is safe and kind of rattle them. Lviv is also a historical and cultural center of Ukraine. So by attacking that, you're sort of attacking the identity of the Ukrainians themselves. So I think there's a lot of possible narratives. And as we know, Putin loves to establish a narrative, no matter how twisted it is, and kind of work on that, which is typical during war, kind of working the psychological aspect of it.
General, that statement, Putin should not remain in power, how would, in your sense, does Putin leverage that for internal propaganda? Does he believe that's the thinking of the White House? How might that change the calculus of this conflict?
Well, as I said, Putin always has a narrative, whether it's his twisted vision of history that we heard a couple of weeks ago, or it's his desire to reestablish the Russian Empire and the previous Soviet Union. And the Ukrainians have been very good about not playing into a narrative or creating a new one, and I would recommend that that's a good strategy to maintain.
Early on the program, General, we had Jack Barsky on. He's a former undercover KGB agent whose craft is intel. And I asked him, you know, how did Putin get it so wrong with his assumptions about the invasion of Ukraine? Here's a part of what he said.
There's no way that Russian intelligence didn't know
in great detail what Russia would be facing. Not so much the FSB, but the military intelligence of Russia is one of the best in the world. Either they were afraid to tell, or they did tell and Putin just dismissed it.
Which one sounds more plausible to you? I mean, the terror of letting your dictator boss know that maybe his ambitions are not likely to succeed, or Putin overruling it and saying, I know best?
You know, I think it's like he said. I think there's a little bit of both there. Clearly, and I've had to deal with them around the world. When you have these strongman dictatorial regimes, nobody wants to tell the boss bad news, and so that is always one of the real Achilles heel of that type leadership. Is people only tell you what you want to hear. But then we also saw Putin kind of berating his lead intel guy when he wouldn't exactly toe the line. So I imagine there were some people that maybe not directly, but were at least giving hints that this thing may not be quite the cakewalk others want it to be, and Putin just doesn't want to hear it and dismisses them. So I think the combination of people not wanting to tell him bad news, plus him not believing it when he hears it, created a really bad situation for his real understanding of what he was up against.
Yeah, as we've talked about, he tried to do that thunder run that you were able to do toward Baghdad, and he was stopped dead in his tracks, and now they're moving to phase 2. We'll see what happens. But we always appreciate your insights, General Perkins. Thank you.
All right, Pete, have a great day.
You too. All right, more twists in the case of missing child Harmony Montgomery, as her father's girlfriend is found dead. Fox Nation host Nancy Grace will tell us what to make of the latest information. She's next.
To my liking, I hold them accountable. The Democrats won't hold the Republicans accountable.
Let's go to David, who's calling from White Pine, Tennessee, on the Republican line. David, good morning.
Good morning. I'm calling from the most conservative area in the United States. That's East Tennessee. I'll make it short. I want to talk about the most misused word in the English language, and it's free. Nothing's free. Someone has to pay for it, and it's probably going to be our kids and our grandkids. And I'll let it go at that. Thank you.
We'd like to thank all of our callers for calling in during our open forum segment. Coming up next, we welcome Spirit of America founder and CEO Jim Hake, who is here to outline the work his group is doing to assist members of Ukraine's military. Stick with us. We'll be right back.
This week on the C-SPAN networks, both chambers of Congress are in session, with the House taking up a bill that would legalize marijuana at the federal level. The Senate will vote on legislation to support the U.S. semiconductor chip industry. The January 6th committee holds a meeting Monday at 7:30 p.m. Eastern to consider recommending that 2 former advisors to President Trump, Peter Navarro and Dan Scavino, be referred to prosecutors for criminal contempt of Congress. Look for that on the C-SPAN networks, cspan.org, and the C-SPAN Now free video app. General Todd Walters, the head of the U.S. European Command and NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Europe, testifies twice on security challenges on the continent. Tuesday at 9:30 a.m., he's before the Senate Armed Services Committee. And Wednesday at 10 a.m., he'll appear before the House Armed Services Committee. Both hearings will be live on cspan.org and the C-SPAN Now free video app. White House Budget Director Shalonda Young is also on Capitol Hill twice. She'll testify on President Biden's 2023 budget before the House Budget Committee Tuesday at 10 a.m. Eastern and before the Senate Budget Committee on Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern. Both hearings will be live on C-SPAN 3 and Thursday at 9 a.m. Eastern, an interview with Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell by Punchbowl News founders Anna Palmer and Jake Sherman. You can watch that live on cspan.org and C-SPAN Now. Then at 10:30 a.m. Eastern, the FCC chair and commissioners testify in an oversight hearing before a House Energy and Commerce subcommittee. You'll be able to watch that on cspan.org and C-SPAN Now. Watch This Week live on the C-SPAN networks or on C-SPAN Now, our free mobile app. Also, head over to cspan.org for scheduling information or to stream video, live or on demand, anytime. C-SPAN, your unfiltered view of government.
for the helpers. So you can always find people who are the way that's
the effect, and also working to make sure that we are providing the off-ramps when the effect is happening. So what we're trying to do is get Vladimir Putin or the people around Vladimir Putin to pressure him to change course, to take their military out of Ukraine, to stop the kind of horrific tactics we've seen, stop the fighting. And so to do that, we have to increase pressure. And every time we see that the pressure we've applied isn't working, continue to do that, while also working to give them these off-ramps so that they can reverse course when they choose to.
Obviously, 2020 hindsight is great, and I'm now applying 2020 hindsight. But should we have imposed sanctions stiffer, sooner? Do you think it would have had any impact on Putin?
You know, I actually don't. And I think President Biden has been masterful in his handling of this, because what Vladimir Putin believed and what he really wanted was for the West to fracture, or for some in Europe to feel differently about what he was doing than others. And the deliberate way that we've gone about doing these sanctions has meant that there has been this extreme transatlantic unity that I think is more powerful than any individual unilateral sanction ever could have been.
All right, so they're more unified, and the sanctions are steeper, but it still hasn't stopped Putin. So what do you make of that?
Look, I think that it takes a long time for some of these sanctions to really take effect. And we know that human nature and individual decision-making is a tricky thing. But what we need to do now is make sure that we continue providing support to Ukrainians so that they can make sure Vladimir Putin doesn't get his objective on the military battlefield. And they have been remarkably successful in that, while also raising the international costs by using these sanctions, while also making sure that we are constantly messaging that there are diplomatic off-ramps, because what we want is for Vladimir Putin to change his mind. What we don't want is for him to feel so cornered and like he's doing so poorly and that so much is at stake that he feels like his only option is to escalate and to double down, because we know that the possibility for that could be catastrophic.
You've on two very powerful committees that have to do with armed services, foreign affairs in the House. Do you anticipate, or give me your level of worry that he's going to use chemical and biological weapons or nuclear weapons?
I think it's a very real possibility that he uses chemical weapons in Ukraine. We have already seen him use many of the same tactics that he's used in Syria, the targeting of civilian infrastructure, etc. And so I would be very concerned that as he continues to see battlefield losses, that he would think to resort to chemical weapons. Now, President Biden has made it very clear that that is unacceptable and that we will respond in some way. NATO has activated its chemical weapons task force, so we're prepared and ready if that happens. But I do think that it's a very real possibility, unfortunately. I see the strategy is that we don't want to make it look like NATO is fighting this war, because that would then escalate it with Putin. But do you see something like, do you see a time when Putin says, look, you're supplying all these defense systems, you're training their military, you're providing money. Do you see him as saying, look, that even though it may not be NATO soldiers on the field, it's NATO backing it up, and that is NATO. Do you worry about that? Well, look, I think Vladimir Putin wants NATO to get involved. I think for his own domestic politics, having this be a war against the United States, a war against NATO, would be much more popular, much more feasible for him than a war in Ukraine. And so I think for him, he wants to get NATO involved. And that's why we need to be so diligent in making sure that we don't do anything that crosses that line. But frankly, Greta, to your point, if just arming and training a military was all it took to be a co-belligerent, we would have much bigger problems around the world and the kinds of wars we would be considered party to. Coming up, a member of Congress in Ukraine before the invasion. I asked Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs about that experience after the break.
Guilt has the is true, but distracting. What are we talking about today? Not the impassioned defense of democracy that the president delivered, but his final 9 words, where he seemed to be calling for regime change. Distracting, undisciplined. And we'll find out whether it is dangerous, whether it is damaging, whether it causes some kind of reaction from Moscow that would not have been coming just as a result of calling Putin a butcher and a war criminal.
Quite the walk back.
It's quite the walk back, and you have the White House really making it very clear that he was not advocating regime change. You had Secretary Blinken come out in Israel also saying that. But there's also a sense that this was a window into what President Biden really thinks and feels. This is after he was holding refugee children. This is after he has met with all these people. And this is after he called President Putin a butcher and a dictator. So in some ways, the logical conclusion, apart from, of course, official U.S. policy, would be the average person thinking, of course, he should not be in power. That said, it is distracting, as Susan said, because now the White House and Republicans, you see Rob Portman calling it a mistake and others jumping on the idea that he made a gaffe.
I'm going to dissent. I'm not sure I would have walked it back. He's a war criminal. He's slaughtering innocent men, women, and children. He illegally invaded Ukraine, and he has got command and control of nuclear weapons. Such a person should not remain in power.
So he's lost his legitimacy, in your mind?
More than lost his legitimacy. And at most, I would have modified the statement by saying it's not a statement of our policy, it's just simply a statement of fact. But, you know, I'd like to see us at some point get to a place where we're not constantly disclaiming the line over which we will not cross. And he said it, you know, presidents every once in a while do say things that ad lib. Reagan was famous
Evil
for this.
Empire, right?
Evil Empire.
That rattled their cages, right?
The bombing starts in 5 minutes, remember that?
Yeah.
So it was a statement of fact. Virtually everyone agrees. Everyone in the Western world agrees.
Yeah, I think everything the Secretary says about Vladimir Putin is correct. I mean, clearly, he shouldn't be in power. It's one thing to say something true. It's another thing to wonder whether it was wise to say it. And this does, as Senator Portman points out, play right into Russian propaganda about the U.S., about the West, about NATO. You know, they have long made the argument that NATO is an offensive alliance that represents a threat to Vladimir Putin, represents a threat to Russian sovereignty. And the U.S. has said, no, no, that's not what we're about. This seems to, I think, feed that. And that's a concern. It also has a domestic effect. If you look at the number of times that President Biden has had to walk back things on this trip, 3 significant statements on this trip alone, and then you go back further and talk about his comment about a minor incursion. He has said things repeatedly that show, I think, the lack of discipline that some people had about concerns about President Biden or Joe Biden as a candidate.
And you know, that may be one reason you have that incredible 71% number in your new poll, that Americans do not have confidence in President Biden
I was surprised
to handle the situation.
by the size of that number.
That includes some of his supporters. That includes a fair number of Democrats. And the idea that White House officials, first anonymously and then the Secretary of State, have to come back and clean something up, I think reinforces the idea of does the president, can we trust him to respond in a competent way to this war?
And of course, never happened during the Trump administration.
Well, it's particularly concerning when you think about the fact.
We're numb to it, by the way, as a public these days. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, it's particularly concerning when you look at that 71% number and think that this was the president who ran on the idea that he was going to come with the A-team, he was going to come with all this experience, and now Americans are saying we're not confident in your policies. I think it was also interesting that in this poll you saw the domestic politics at play when it comes to thinking of who do people blame for the inflation and prices. They're not blaming Russia, they're blaming President Biden's policies. That also is something that is in some ways concerning to White House officials.
Well, I looked up, the 1942 midterms didn't go well for FDR. And the Democrats, for what it's worth, we are sometimes always about our pocketbook, Jay.
Yes, and as my friend, the late Andy Kohut, used to say, when it comes to polls, with all due respect to NBC, it depends on how you ask the question. If you ask Americans the binary choice between the economy, i.e. my wallet, versus something else, they're almost always going to say the economy is more important.
Yeah, and yet the president's focus actually has to be on the war, Steve.
It does. I mean, it has to be on the war, and I think part of the reason that he's struggling on the economy is, one, we're not seeing any improvement, and two, he's not willing to do the kinds of things that I think both with respect to the war and the economy that might actually help. I mean, if you talk about an all-in energy policy that would address some of the things that we're seeing come out of Russia and potentially forestall some of the inflation, he could make the case, but I don't think his base will let him.
Look, I want to bring up that you brought up the poll numbers and President Biden. On the who do you blame on inflation, I just want to put it out here because, you know, the most generous way you could look at it, Susan, is, well, only 38% blame President Biden, and a majority blame something else. But that's about all you can do. What's interesting is that only 6% blame the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that was a specific thing the president said.
Well, and of course, inflation was becoming a problem before Russia invaded Ukraine, although it's clearly jacked up gas prices and had some other effects. But this is of great concern to the White House. You know, 3 of the last 4 presidents have lost control of the House of Representatives in their first midterm election. And is there anybody in Washington who doesn't think that's going to happen in November?
Well, it's funny, and Yamiche, I'm going to put up our generic ballot test here. And the public's going to look at it. You'll see 46-44, Republicans up by 2. Oh, that's not. That's a coin flip. This is the first time we've had Republicans leading on the generic ballot in our polls since September of 2014, 8 years ago. There's always a little bit of a Democratic average because there's more Democrats are more packed in some districts here. This is a huge red flag.
It's a huge red flag, and it is coupled with the idea that people are blaming President Biden's policies for inflation. It's coupled with the idea that Americans are still very, very concerned about how much they're paying for so many other things, not just gas. And that also is, I think, part of the reason why when you ask people right now, they're essentially saying that Republicans are the ones who they trust with the economy. That's going to be a hard thing for Democrats to overcome and to message about.
Yeah, well, in this gas issue, it's a regressive tax. It impacts people harder, farther down the socioeconomic ladder. As we go to break, we want to remember Madeleine Albright, who died on Wednesday. As a young girl, Albright and her family fled then Czechoslovakia twice, once on the brink of World War II and then again when the communists overthrew the Czech government in 1948. She grew up to become the U.S. representative of the United Nations and the first ever woman Secretary of State. She was raised a Catholic and did not learn until late in life that her family was actually Jewish, but had to keep that heritage a secret because of the Second World War. Albright appeared on Meet the Press 23 times, including this moment from 1997.
People have asked me if I ever thought this was possible. Did I ever think that I, Madeleine Corbell, at that stage, 11 years old, coming to the United States, could ever be Secretary of State? I would have said absolutely not. So I have achieved my highest ambitions, except for one, and that is to do the very best job that it's possible to do.
Madeleine Albright was 84.
Ukrainians need 2 things. They need us to help them win. Managing their decline is not what they need. They need us to help them win. They need more. But also, they need us to inspire the Russian people to put this guy where he belongs. And so when the White House staff walks back the commander-in-chief of the United States, it degrades Joe Biden's ability to inspire that population. So I wish they would have thought twice about that, because I really think it hurt him.
Well, Karen, as a former Democratic staffer, somebody who's worked at senior positions on campaigns and in policy settings, what did you make of that, the walk back?
Well, it had the feeling of, it was a beautiful speech. He made the comment. When you hear it, you knew that was not the message of the speech. And so you could almost see the staffers sort of getting ready to go walk it back. But I have to say, with Scott, I agree. I would not have, I understand the geopolitics. I might have tried to say it a little differently. I might have tried to say, of course, he's not talking about regime change, but we are saying to the Russian people, you have to take control here. You have a role to play here. But having been in that position, I think they felt like the most immediate need was to make sure our allies were comfortable.
Let's switch gears for a minute to President Putin. And I want to play something that he said this past week that was odd. I'll just leave it there, and then we'll talk about it.
Children's book writer J.K. Rowling was recently cancelled because she, the author of books that spread far and wide in hundreds of millions of copies, did not please the fans of the so-called gender freedoms. Today, they are trying to cancel a whole 1,000-year-old country, our people. I am talking about the increasing discrimination of everything related to Russia, about this trend which is unfolding in a number of Western states.
Okay, obviously on its face, the idea of the Russian president saying that he's a victim of cancel culture is ridiculous. We should note that J.K. Rowling responded saying, in a tweet saying, critiques of Western cancel culture are possibly not best made by those currently slaughtering civilians for the crime of resistance or who jail and poison their critics, hashtag I stand with Ukraine. But aside from the kind of ridiculousness of that, since everybody's trying to figure out what Putin is thinking and what he's doing, what does that kind of comment tell you about where he is?
You're hearing a deranged mind under pressure.
it should not be understated how damaging U.S. sanctions, global sanctions, have been on the Russian economy. The ruble has cratered in large measure because of the central bank sanctions put together by the United States. And the Russian economy has taken a bigger hit in this 1 month than the U.S. economy ever took in any given year of the Great Depression. There is panic on the streets of Russia. And while he is an autocrat, he is subject to public opinion in Russia. And he is under significant pressure right now and is looking for an off-ramp. We need to work with Ukraine and indeed with China to provide that off-ramp.
Rebecca, 25 seconds left.
No, I think Vladimir Putin is most guilty of canceling Russia, if anybody is. I mean, he's the one who has really set his country back. This is going to be a strategic loss, I think, for Russia in the end. I think some of this, you know, this idiotic kind of Russophobia kind of coming out, canceling Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Russian ballet dancers, of course, is wrong and misplaced. But he does not represent the beauty of Russian culture. And so, again, I agree that his comments should not be taken seriously.
He's trying to align himself with the people in the United States who are whining about cancel culture all the time. Don't fall for it.
Okay. It's a nice way to end it. Thank you so much, all of you. Great discussion. And up next, his group is making 10,000 sandwiches a day for Ukrainian refugees. And now Chef Jose Andres is actually back in Ukraine. We're going to talk to him about his efforts after a quick break.
I brought in These are my famous last
Don't be fooled by that beat-up old cap. It's
invested in the equipment you need to acquire liquefied natural gas cargoes. And they did this precisely because they didn't want to be reliant on Russia as a primary supplier of energy. Germany took the opposite view. It wagered that interreliance with Russia was a good thing, that it would help reform Russia's economy, and in the process make Russia more amenable to Germany's foreign policy aims. And that proved to be a disastrous bet. Now Germany's dealing with the consequences. You know, the consequences are substantial because Germany finds itself in a position where it's hesitant to cut off Russian energy because of the price. But the reality is that this is a situation that Germany itself set up for. The German economy because of the strategic decisions that they've made, and because unlike their neighbors in Poland, Lithuania, and elsewhere, they didn't take this problem seriously over the past decade when they should have. If you look at Germany's decisions since 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and started its war on Ukraine, Germany's become more reliant on Russian gas for that time period, which suggests, I think, the extent to which Germans just haven't taken this seriously until right now.
Chris, thanks as always for your amazing analysis. Chris Miller is the assistant professor of international history at Tufts University's Fletcher School. He's the author of an important book called Putinomics, Power and Money in Resurgent Russia. Well, millions of children have been forced to leave best friends, miss spring parties and school plays, and say goodbye to beloved family members. It's incomprehensible. After the break, I'm going to speak with a teenage refugee who's just arrived here in Warsaw. She's joining in efforts to help other refugees where she can, going to train and bus station with volunteers. This is a special special edition of Velshi Live from Poland.
I could have to benefit Ukrainian refugees.
Tell us really quickly about that special. We want to save some time here for your performance as well, but tell us about what you're doing for the refugees of Ukraine.
Yeah, well, when I was a brief story, when I was a young boy, I remember a friend of mine asked, hey, can I borrow $70? And I remember thinking to myself, well, I always heard that you don't give money to people that are, to friends that are in need of money, per se, because it gets into some blurry lines. And I went to my dad and I said, hey, what do I do with this? And he just looked at me and said something that was very inspiring. And he said, man, when people are in need, you help. And so when it comes to this Mojave Desert special that we've done, I mean, I think we've all been brokenhearted by what's been taking place over in Ukraine. And so if people, everybody can play a part, everybody can do something. And for us, this is our way to hopefully help people that are being displaced, that are going through incredibly difficult things as we speak. And we sort of said we were not going to put a price tag on this thing. We thought maybe 50 grand. So it's for our supporters to show up with 150 grand and counting is just incredible.
Yeah, it says a lot about your fans and both of you as well. So when someone's in need, you help. Well, this is King and Country. Let's get right to the performance.
Wonderful. Let's listen.
That had bed bugs, and I was totally not. I was living in the East Village, and it was I was new to the world.
So $25,000 is a lot of money.
Huge amount of money.
Yes.
And they were like, yeah, he just wants you to come to the Super Bowl. And I was like, what do you mean, come to the Super Bowl? And my manager at the time was like, trust me, it's cool. Like, Jamie Foxx will be there, Leonardo DiCaprio, like other celebs will be there.
How much do you think they got paid?
I would love to know. I would love to know. Love to know. I mean, I do know that, you know, it's public record that like there were Basquiats that were seized from, you know, these actors' homes and whatever, that were gifts from Jolo.
God.
Yeah.
It's worth it. I mean, just to show up at the Super Bowl. Like,
Yeah, well, I didn't care about football, so my
did you
dad
like
was
cheer
really...
at the wrong moments?
Oh,
Like,
I had no idea what was going on at all.
Yeah.
So I wasn't even pretending, and that was the other really bizarre thing about these interactions is like, you know, you don't actually have to do that. Like I wasn't being told to cheer or anything. But what was interesting in both of these experiences was watching how other women like saw opportunities and capitalized on them and was like, okay, like this guy obviously wants to have beautiful women around. Like how can I parlay this into something larger? And I think that at a certain point in my life, I was like, I would never do that. Meanwhile, I'm, you know, doing paid posts for toothpaste that are owned by the same type of men, essentially. Right. And maybe the transaction is a little bit more clear, but that was another instance of sort of like judging my own internalized misogyny, and also, you know, kind of like realizing how we all exist on the spectrum of compromise.
And you can watch the full program anytime online at cspan.org/.
Much more quickly than they.
I want to say something.
Whether it's $5 or a much greater sum, trust us to do the right thing. And we, since we're not, and that's our accountability, is we have to produce results, and we do.
Let's talk to Kathleen, who's calling from Fort Bragg, California. Kathleen, good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Haig. I just want to say I'm proud of you. I don't really have a question. I've been reading along what you've got published online, and it just seems like your organization is really lined up with how I feel about America, so I thank you.
Kathleen, thank you.
What do you say to Americans who want to go overseas and help in a way like Spirit of America is doing, but want to do it on their own instead of with an NGO?
Well, it's an extraordinarily complex situation over there, and I've been really busy doing what we're doing, setting up the infrastructure that we have, raising money so that we can deliver the assistance. You know, the first plane was about 20 tons of assistance and valued at about $4 million. The one leaving this week is 35 tons and $6 million of assistance, the kinds of things that I just mentioned. So I have been really busy with that, and so is our whole team. In terms of the other things that people can do, I can't really say, but what I would caution people, including donors, is, and this was also true in the Afghanistan crisis response and the evacuation, these situations are much, much more complex than they might seem from sitting here in the comfort of the United States. And a lot of times there's a lot of winging it that's going on. And as an entrepreneur and business person myself before starting Spirit of America, I'm used to a certain level of flexibility and figuring things out as you go along. But doing so in a responsible way, not only responsible, but that has an impact on the ground, that's what we've focused on figuring out how to do for almost 20 years now. So I would encourage people to pump the brakes a little bit on hopping on a plane and trying to get over there and jump into the fracas, but find the people who are doing the work and help them do the work in whatever way you can.
So what would you say is the best way the average American can help?
Well, I'm going to speak to our organization because that's what I'm familiar with. I know what we have in place, and I know what the impact is going to be. Which $1 in our system today is going to have an impact in Ukraine in 5 days. So I'm very certain about that. In terms of all the other good work that other organizations are doing, I'm sure it's out there. I'm just not familiar enough to be able to speak to it, honestly. So folks can go to spiritofamerica.org. the funds that are contributed to what we're doing in Ukraine, 100% of those funds will go to the things that I just mentioned a moment ago. And that's our, we call it a 100% promise. Our other costs we're able to take care of that through other means of support of the organization. But if people go to our website today and contribute $10 or $100 or whatever, all that money will go to provide assistance on the ground in Ukraine very, very quickly.
Let's talk to Adabena, who is calling from New York. Adabena, good morning.
Yes, hi, good morning, Jesse. Good morning, Jim. My name is Abena Smith, and I just want to say I love what you do, Mr. Haig. I love the work of your Spirit of America around the world, and specifically with the focus on Ukraine right now, which is very much needed. And I appreciate that you also made a point to appropriately characterize President Zelenskyy and the plight of democracy. Many of us here in America, we take that for granted. We don't know the trials and tribulations that this country has come through to get to where we are, and still we are always ever mindful that it is a precious fight day to day. So I thank you for that, and also as a military mom, I appreciate that you're doing what you're doing. My son is in the region right now, and I am definitely standing with Ukraine. I thank you for standing with Ukraine, and I will do my best to promote what you do on Twitter. I hope you have a Twitter handle. Thank you.
I do, and we do. And thank you very much. And one of the things that is true is that those who serve, and I thank you for your son's service, the moms and dads and the husbands and wives of those who serve don't really get the appreciation that you deserve. So that is a hard thing to have a son in harm's way. And thank you.
Well, we're about out of time, so we want to.
You know what? Now First Alert Weather Team gives you the most accurate.
Your finger.
Call 1-866.
And our free awning idea.
Box office records at the time. Not bad for a film made by a director who, at first, didn't even want to make it. Back then, Francis Ford Coppola was a young filmmaker in business with another young gun, George Lucas. But when Coppola first read Mario Puzo's book, The Godfather, he was underwhelmed.
And I thought, this is just sort of salacious, trying to make money kind of book. And so I disregarded it. When they offered it to me, I turned it down.
What changed your mind?
George Lucas came to me and says, Francis, we're going broke. They're going to chain the door for the lack of paying the rent of our American Zoetrope studio. And you have to do this. We have no other alternative. We need the money.
So Coppola took the job, framing it as a dark tale of family succession, and almost immediately began to butt heads with Paramount studio brass.
I was very young. I was 29. I had no power. They could easily push me around, which they did and tried to.
Coppola wanted New York stage actor Al Pacino to play Michael. The studio wanted anyone but, and considered people like Robert Redford, Ryan O'Neal, and Warren Beatty. They also wanted Sir Laurence Olivier in the title role, but Coppola held out for Marlon Brando. At 46 and in top physical shape, Brando didn't look anything like an aging Don.
That I cannot do.
But with some world-class makeup, he was able to transform himself into a character he knew just how to play.
We've known each other many years, but this is the first time you ever came to me for counsel, for help.
The cat was Coppola's idea.
It was a studio cat. I just put it in his hand. He would never say, what do you want me to do? I joked that, like, if he's in a scene, Brandon was in a scene and a herd of buffalo ran by in character, he would say, oh, look at the buffalo. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
He would make use of anything. And he was great. He was a genius, no doubt about it.
Now you've had your drink.
And talk about genius. Robert Duvall, as family attorney Tom Hagen, did this scene in 2 takes.
They shot Sonny on the causeway. He's dead.
As always, Duvall had his lines down cold. Brando probably didn't.
He didn't like to memorize lines?
Yeah, well, he claimed that by seeing the lines, he could be fresher. I think it was a form of laziness. I mean, in the scene with Pacino out in the backyard, he had a great big sign in a tree. He'd look up at the tree say the lines from off the tree way up, you know.
That's wild, but it just looks like he's thinking.
Yeah, well, you know, he was able to do that.
But even with all that talent, Coppola was in constant fear of losing his job. The studio hated his ideas, and some of the crew, he says, would badmouth him behind his back.
This one. All these people here, and you look so alone.
Well, that's really, this picture is how I felt during the picture. I was not a happy camper, as they say.
Coppola wasn't totally alone. He'd cast 2 allies as Corleone's siblings, James Caan as Sonny, and his real-life sister, Talia Shire, as Connie. But they feared the worst.
For those first couple of weeks that we were all shooting, Francis's job was in jeopardy.
Yeah.
I mean, and so my sister shouldn't have been on that set, I will tell you that, because it was very, very tough.
But a turning point came after Paramount execs saw the dailies for this scene, where Al Pacino, as Michael, prepares to kill 2 of his family's mortal enemies. The sound of the train helps build tension that you can feel and see behind Pacino's eyes until the moment he strikes. But for all the shoot-'em-up, some at Paramount worried that The Godfather as scripted wasn't violent enough. Coppola says they actually wanted to hire someone to pump up the action in the film, so he choreographed the violent fight scene between Talia Shire's character Connie and her no-good husband Carlo, played by Gianni Russo.
And I remember the plates were heavy, so I'd go, and it wouldn't break, and it didn't break. And so my shoes came off, and I kept just running around in the broken things because you don't want to take 2. But it was intense.
Talk about intense. For the scene where Sonny is gunned down at the toll booth, technicians wired everything with small explosive charges called squibs to simulate bullet strikes.
On me, I had 147. Around the toll booth was 5,000.
Oh, Jesus.
Were you scared?
A little, but there were girls on the set, and I had to do it. I swear I wish I was lying.
The result was a shockingly realistic ballet of brutality that looked lethal and actually could have been.
It would blow a hole in your hand if you put your hand right here like that.
You can't do it many times,
You don't
right?
want to take 2. That's a... No,
Take 2?
No, take 2
Are
with
you
that.
crazy?
No. You're still like an older brother. Like, did you notice that? Madame.
And the winner is Mario Puzo and Francis Ford Coppola for The Godfather.
The first Godfather movie won 3 Oscars, but it was bigger than that.
You come here unannounced on the day my daughter is to be married.
It changed our culture in ways that still resonate today, from The Simpsons to The Sopranos.
Is it true, Michael?
On the ground, killing innocent civilians, we all together have to do more. We have to stop him.
An advisor to President Zelenskyy described NATO's response to Russia's invasion as an appeasement. Do you agree with that characterization?
We definitely are reliving this 1939 moment, and I think we all have to understand that, you know, it's not only about Ukraine, and the reason why Putin attacked Ukraine is, of course, because he wants to eliminate us as a free democratic neighbor, but it's also because he hates everything that is democratic, that he would like to destroy anything that is not autocratic and that cannot be occupied. So it's up for all of us to understand that we have to stop it, and in order to stop it, we never ask the boots on the ground, but we ask all the civilized countries to provide us with all the tools necessary in order not only to defend us, to defend Europe, but also to stop it and stop this war.
The President Biden, said that Vladimir Putin cannot remain in power. The White House walked it back, as you saw, saying the U.S. does not support regime change. What's your reaction to this?
Look, it was a great speech of President Biden. He clearly said that U.S. is and will be with Ukraine in this fight, and we really appreciate it, and we would like everyone to be with us in the most possible ways. Now, we all understand and we see it, and say, I would like to thank all journalists for spreading the truth and showing for what it is. It's a brutal aggression of a neighboring country, of a peaceful neighbor that never posed any threat unless being democratic is a threat. Russia attacked us in 2014. They started full-fledged war 33 days ago. They're killing civilians, killing children, destroying our hospitals, civilian infrastructure, residential homes, everywhere. It's an act of war criminal. That's why we have opened investigation in Ukraine. That's why Ukraine submitted all the application to all international courts. And yes, Vladimir Putin, together with everyone, every Russian that is responsible for it, will have to end up in jail for these war crimes. So yes, he has nothing to do to lead a state if Russia would like to be a democratic or even a civilized state.
So you're saying that there should be regime change?
Well, it's clear to us that Russia is a terrorist state led by a war criminal. And we are working day and night and fighting fiercely to defend our land and to defend our democracy, and everyone should be brought to justice. So I think it will be difficult to run a state from The Hague.
Madam Ambassador, Russian military officials are starting to signal a potential shift in strategy, focusing on Crimea and the two regions of the Donbass. Are there any circumstances in which the Ukrainians would give up those areas in order to make a peace agreement with Russia?
First, we can always count on Russia lying. They lied before the war that they will not start the war. They lied in 2014 that they did not attack us when they illegally occupied Crimea and Donetsk and Lugansk. And they are lying during the past 33 days about not attacking civilians, about not besieging Mariupol and killing people there, about not kidnapping people and taking them into Russia, what they are doing, and all of that. So I think the signals that we hear from Russia merely comes from the fact that they were not able to do anything that they have planned to achieve, either blitzkrieg, taking over Kiev, nobody is greeting them with flowers, and all Ukrainians are defending the country and telling Russians go home. So they're just simply lying, as Solzhenitsyn say, and we all know they lie. Now, on the question of, I don't even think we should be asking Ukraine what we are ready to give up. We are fighting for our country. The territorial integrity and sovereignty of any country is enshrined not only in the Statute of UN, but should be enshrined in every heart and mind of anyone who believes in democracy. So after this brutal aggression, we are, of course, ready to negotiate, and we are negotiating the humanitarian corridors, and we are ready to negotiate a peace agreement. But the peace agreement should include them leaving our territory, all of it. And no, we are not ready to give up on some of our people or some of our territories and leave it under occupation, because occupation, as we see now, as we saw in 1932 during the Holodomor, as we saw in previous times when Russia occupied us, occupation for Ukrainians means extermination of us.
Your job, most of your job here in Washington, is to try to get more funds, more weapons from Congress and from the administration. Have you received pushback on getting the missiles, the defensive missiles that you're asking for, that President Zelenskyy asked for again just yesterday?
I think we have very constructive talks here, and we're trying to convince all of our partners, and especially here in the US, that in order for the civilized world to stop this war and win this fight, because it's not only fight for Ukraine, all of us are at risk, we need all weapons, especially those that will enable us to protect our skies. We need much stronger sanctions. We need to sanction all of Russia's financial system, all of their banks. We need, all the support we can get, because it's not only about Ukraine. It's about aggression by a brutal dictator, by a nuclear power that attacked the only country, Ukraine is the only country, that voluntarily got rid of the third largest nuclear arsenal, which we used to have in 1994, in exchange for guarantees, we thought, as it turned out to be assurances, from Russia, from the US and Great Britain.
So, okay, thank you so much, Madam Ambassador. I really appreciate you coming on and talking with me this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to all Americans who are helping us on this fight.
Thank you. And experts are surprised that Russia doesn't appear to have launched major cyber attacks against the U.S. But could that change? Senate Intelligence Chairman Mark Warner is here next. Plus, really terrible news for women and girls in Afghanistan this week. Is there anything the U.S. can do about it now? Congressman Mike McCall is coming up.
Hitting the road? Not all 5G networks are created equal. T-Mobile covers more interstate highways.
Today at WashingtonPavilion.org.
I pledge to be there for you when disaster strikes, to guide you through your claim.
To offer personalized coverage. From people speculate, that perhaps NATO, Ukraine needs to make concessions, rule out joining NATO, or even ceding Crimea or the territories in the east. Is any of that on the table? The idea of rewarding the Russians for all of this by ceding territory in the east?
Well, Russians has naturally put everything on a table, while there are like absolutely clear red lines for Ukraine. And these are red lines, first of all, for Ukrainian people, but also for the whole world, because now we have the decision of the International Court of Justice abiding Russian Federation to stop the military operation and to refrain from any military action. So this is one point where no discussions are possible. Second element, that there's no discussions which are possible as regards territorial integrity and sovereignty and inevitability of Ukrainian territory. And of course, Ukraine will never step up for any element of discussions which would anyhow legitimize all the war crimes which has been committed in Ukrainian territory.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Prime Minister, and thank you for your resolve and your bravery. Appreciate your time. Let's bring in former CIA Director and retired four-star General David Petraeus. General Petraeus, first of all, let's pick up what we just heard there. The idea that giving any concessions as part of negotiations with Russia would be rewarding basically their terrorism that they've rained down upon the Ukrainian people.
Yeah, I mean, it indicates that the Venn diagrams, if you will, what's acceptable, in other words, to President Putin and also to President Zelenskyy, there's still very little overlap, if any. Basically, what you have is a president in Moscow who's watching his economy, his financial system, his inner circle, and his business community be seriously damaged, in some cases irreparably so. And then, of course, another president in Kyiv who's watching his country slowly be damaged, parts of it destroyed, terrible loss of innocent life as well as of his forces. Although the battlefield situation is a bit of a bloody stalemate, Ukrainians actually having halted the Russians around Kyiv, Kharkiv, and some others, and even pushing them back a bit in Kyiv. But then you have the situation in Mariupol, which has become a bit of a Ukrainian Alamo at this point in time. It's fighting to the last defender. And pinning down multiple Russian battalions in so doing, very heroically. But ultimately, it looks as if it's going to have to collapse. It's going to be taken. And when it does, that is a moment of some peril for Ukraine, because now that port can be used by the Russians. Remember, they were using a port just to the west of that where a ship was hit and destroyed, Russian ship. They'll now have quite a good port on the Sea of Azov out to the Black Sea. And then it will free up a number of battalions that were the ones that have been closing the circle, closing the noose on Mariupol, who can then push further north and perhaps enable Russia to achieve what it has now said as it's redefined its objectives to taking control of all of the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, provinces, if you will, and then solidifying its grip on a land corridor from the Donbass, from those two oblasts all the way to Crimea. So this is going to be a very tenuous period the next few days as we see what happens in Mariupol, what the Russians are able to do as a result of it, and then how the Ukrainians can respond, because it's a very long distance from anywhere where they might have forces that they could possibly spare. And of course, in the meantime, very understandably, you have President Zelenskyy, who, despite hearing this extraordinary commitment from President Biden and from all the leaders of NATO at the summit this past week, nonetheless wants more. And I fully understand that. I mean, he's like a battlefield commander, and no commander has ever had enough forces, drones, Air Force, whatever it may be. And that's the position in which he finds himself, and we should understand that. And what we need to do is provide everything we can that can be provided without needlessly provoking a direct confrontation with Russia. I very much understand President Biden's concerns about that.
Let me ask you about that, because we saw President Biden's speech in Warsaw outline this basically as the struggle, the fight of our time. But there was that line at the end of his speech where he said flatly that Putin must go, that this man must not remain in power. Obviously, that's not, that's not the policy, but how does something like that, and made headlines all around the world, how does that complicate the efforts to resolve this situation?
Well, it reminds us that message discipline has its virtues. That was reportedly very clearly an unscripted moment, in addition, in the emotion of that very emotional moment. And, it will cause some challenges down the road. It will disappear, the headlines will move on to something else within a few days. But in the mind of Putin, who's someone who has, watched and rewatched, old videos of Gaddafi being taken and killed, this kind of thing, it will play on his mind, and it could complicate matters go down the road. Look, I think President Biden would be the first, knowing him, he'd be the first to say, oops, okay, hey guys, okay, well, let's get on with it. And this should not overshadow what was an extraordinarily important and successful trip to Europe, one that the U.S. really led, as it has done so impressively, really, throughout this entire effort, and pulled together, guided, and then ultimately with this speech it was a very, very strong statement, obviously.
I want to ask you a little flashback here to a statement made by the president of Poland visiting Tbilisi, Georgia, after the Russians invaded Georgia back in 2008, a statement that echoes today. He said at that time, again, this is 2008, today Georgia, tomorrow Ukraine, the day after tomorrow the Baltic states, and later perhaps time will come for my country, Poland. Obviously, Ukraine did come. Is there a concern here that whatever ends up resolving this, if there is a resolution here with the Russians backing down, that rewarding them in any way for this is ultimately a green light for Putin's ultimate plan to rebuild the Russian Empire?
Jonathan, I tend to think that this has complicated any ambitions that he might have had very, very considerably. This is going to set back his military for years. It's shown the whole world that it wasn't the wonderfully modernized force that everybody thought it might be. This has been a huge challenge for the Russians. The fact that they've lost 7 generals just because they can't command and control sufficiently, they have to get out of their armored vehicles and go forward to find out why are they stopped again, this kind of thing. So I tend to think that his ambitions are going to be seriously set back by what takes place in Ukraine, noting that this is by no means nearing a conclusion.
All right, General David Petraeus, thank you very much for joining us on This Week. Coming up, as Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson moves one step closer to joining the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas is facing new scrutiny about his wife's involvement in attempts to overturn the 2020 election. We'll discuss the fallout with Senator Amy Klobuchar next.
This isn't...
Monkey, I think it's shockingly personal.
There's a lot more to Ketanji. That's not an American name to begin with. It was not, she's not truthful, not honest. She was asked about the critical race theory. She said, well, I don't know anything about it. Well, then there was proof, video proof, that she was actually teaching a class in it. She lies.
So, John, first of all, what makes you think Ketanji's not an American name?
Well, I've never heard any American names. It's an African name, I would believe. She might have been named in America, but that's not an American name.
And John, how much of the hearings did you actually watch? Did you spend a couple of days watching it, or did you just watch?
Yeah. A lot of it. A lot of it. Parts were okay. So she was asked, what is a woman? Well, I think that was in reference to her transgender beliefs. Well, so she answers, I'm not a biologist. Well, she was asked, what is salt? Well, she could have answered, well, I don't know, I'm not a chemist. She could have at least honored the question. She knew what it was all about. She just decided to be belligerent and give a stupid answer. There are no simple questions. There are only stupid answers.
So, John, do you think that Senate confirmation hearings for Supreme Court nominees are useful at all? Because in previous Supreme Court nomination hearings, other nominees did not answer all the questions either. There seems to be becoming a pattern.
Well, I disagree with you there. I listened to most of them, and most of them answered honestly, and they go by the Constitution. She is not sticking to the Constitution. She is not going by rule of law guidelines. Right, this one guy that was supposed to guidelines for up to 10 years. Boy, she let him out with 3. As soon as and he was convicted over and over pedophile. And he got out and he committed the same crime again and then murdered somebody. You know, why should you fight it once again? If she followed the law, this person would still be alive. And these little kids would have been raped. She is dishonest, and she doesn't go by the law. She goes by her own opinion.
Let's go to Melvin, who's calling from Hollywood, Florida. Melvin, good morning.
Good morning. I support Ketanji Brown Jackson. Judge Jackson seemed to do a great job when she had to deal with Senator Cruz and when she had to deal with Senator Cotton. Their questions seemed to be off the wall and outside of what they really needed to ask. I think she did a good job. I think she has the intelligence to be a great Supreme Court justice.
Now, Melvin, do you think that these type of confirmation hearings are worth the time, considering that there are a lot of questions that senators ask that they know nominees won't answer? It seems to have been a pattern for the last few Supreme Court nominees that there are questions they're not going to answer, but it seems like anyway. Are these hearings even useful to anyone?
I would still say so, yes, because I think it's important that the American people are able to hear what our Supreme Court justices think, and to a certain degree, what they sound like. I mean, up until this point, we've never heard of Judge Jackson. This gives us the capability to have some form of relationship with her, and once she goes on to the court, assuming she's confirmed, we'll have that connection that we'll have with her. I think it's important to have that type of connection with, well, she's not an elected official, but with our higher bodies of our court system. So I think this is a good move. I don't think it's a bad idea at all. I support Ketanji Jackson. I watched the confirmation hearing. I didn't think it was right for them to do what they did. I think that Senator Klobuchar and a lot of them did a great job of trying to balance out the insanity with more substantive questions.
Well, Bloomberg columnist Jonathan Bernstein wrote about the problems that Supreme Court confirmation hearings have and why they should continue. And I want to bring to you a little bit of what he said here. This is from Bloomberg columnist Jonathan Bernstein. Senators have many better ways than public hearings to learn what they need to know, including private conversations with the nominee. So why have the hearings? As political scientist Nadia E. Brown pointed out on Twitter, they are political theater. But she added, I like political theater. So do I. This kind of theater can convey some substantive material to the public. Hearings construct a public record to supplement the private deliberations that start as soon as the Supreme Court vacancy is announced. Hearings can also tell us lots of things about what politicians and political parties think is important. They can shine public light on previously obscure topics. Of course, what politicians and parties care about may seem foolish or worse, but that's not the fault of the hearing process. Once again, this comes from Jonathan Bernstein, who is a Bloomberg columnist. Well, where do you stand on the
to violate every single one of them?
Yeah, and that's, again, this sort of clarifying thing that I think is an interesting and important part of the story that you tell in the book. This institution that you served for 33 years in places like Mogadishu, Somalia, and in, Kyrgyzstan and Russia and Ukraine. This institution that you served for 33 years is basically sort of under assault, repeated feints, and you very unwittingly become a test, not just one that ultimately explodes your own career, but the institution itself. It reveals, the fissures and weak points in this institution. And, I'm curious, there are later accounts, John Bolton and others, and the testimony and impeachment shows that in that spring, Pompeo was probably holding off Donald Trump for quite some time in terms of firing you. But in the end, both Bolton and Pompeo cave when ordered to directly by the President of the United States. So that's an interesting question. Are they, in the end, as far as you're concerned, his enablers? Or is it just a story about your system? The President has enormous power and you can only resist for so long. Is it better to be there and to be sort of somewhat complicit but resisting, or not? This is the big question, I know, but I'd love to know your answer, because it was your life, it was your career.
Right. I think that's a good question, and I think it's a question that everybody who works in government has to ask themselves at some point, because you're not going to love every policy of an administration. Yeah. And so how are you going to deal with that? So, for example, the second war in Iraq, I thought that was wrong. Not that anybody was pushing, I'm not a Middle Eastern hand, but not that anybody was pushing for me to go to Iraq, but I tried to stay out of the mainstream of that. I think everybody has to find their own path to that. With regard to Pompeo and Bolton, I think it's both. I think they were his enablers, but I think that probably they did do some good things as well. We'll see. I think books, including your own, that are going to about the Trump administration, and I think we're going to continue to find out a lot that's been happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, we can talk about impeachment now. It's very interesting because it has taken on, I think, a different light now that we see this incredible war that has broken out between Russia and Ukraine, a war that tragically American diplomacy and assistance to Ukraine was not only not able to prevent, but there's an interesting set of questions about, what things like Trump's Ukraine scandal had to do with enabling the war in the first place. And so let's talk about that fall. This is an incredible trauma you've already had of, being withdrawn as ambassador, middle of the night phone call. I'm sure people remember this part of your story, and you're summoned back to Washington. The leadership never even has the courage to look you in the eye and tell you. You never hear from Mike Pompeo. And it's Carol Perez, the head of the Foreign Service, right, who basically gives you the hook. And, they tell you, well, you did nothing wrong. But sorry.
And so Deputy Secretary of Sullivan, when I actually got on the next plane to Washington, Deputy Secretary Sullivan called me in.
Right.
And
now our ambassador to Moscow, interestingly.
Yeah, under very tough conditions.
Yeah.
So he was the one who got handed that assignment of firing me officially, which he did.
Mm-hmm. And but he also told you that you didn't do anything wrong.
Yes, he did. And I was so angry. And sometimes when I'm angry, it's expressed through just all these tears. And I was sort of I think it was probably a pretty unpleasant conversation for him. It certainly was for me, in terms of how can you be doing this? If I haven't done anything wrong, how can you be doing this?
Yeah. And they didn't give you a good answer.
Well, what they said is they wanted to protect me. But what they wanted to protect me from was being fired by tweet.
Yeah.
And actually, my own view, even at that moment, was that they were protecting themselves and they were protecting the president. Because even though, you know, ambassadors have this exalted title, I mean, you and I both know we are not actually very senior in an administration. And if Donald Trump had fired me by tweet, I mean, everybody would have wondered what was going on.
That's right.
Everybody would have. I mean, it was diplomatic malpractice anyway, but that would have, you know, kind of sealed the deal.
Right. It would have been a public scandal earlier.
Yes.
Yeah. And it would have called attention to what Giuliani was doing in a different way.
Exactly.
So it was self-protective. But I was struck in your account of that meeting and in general the ordeals that followed on from that. You know, you describe yourself as a rule follower. It seems to me like, you know, that there is a sort of gendered element to this, that you really, like, it took you a while to fight your way back to righteous anger. And if anybody was entitled to righteous anger, it was you. But that you know, this mix of like, have I done something wrong? Are they going to ruin me? Fear.
Yeah.
And I think explaining to people a little bit about the fear that you felt in that moment when powerful people and forces that you don't understand, including the president, are out to get you. That's the part that seemed like you and I might understand it in the former Soviet Union or in Russia, but that's been so kind of revelatory to me to understand that Trump used fear to take over the Republican Party in a large swath of Washington.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, just speaking about myself, I mean, you described it really well. I didn't know what was going to happen next, because in my world, if you pull an ambassador out of post, and there was all this talk that I was corrupt and everything else, by people very close to the president, consequences follow. You know, in a normal world, there would be an investigation. You know, perhaps charges would be brought. I wondered whether, you know, as an additional, because we know the president can be quite petty sometimes, I wondered whether they would try to take away my pension, because of course at that point I was thinking about retiring. I wondered whether I would be able to get a job anywhere, because there was this little cloud over me. And on the one hand, I knew I had done nothing wrong. But on the other hand, I'm like thinking, could I have done something? You know? I mean, you know, that self-doubt of, oh my God, you know, maybe I'm like not understanding this all properly. And so that was, you know, sort of in the spring of 2019, and then fast forward to the perfect call.
Right, it's released in September.
Released in September, and that's when I heard, or when I saw the transcript where the President of the United States says, she's going to go through some things.
That's right.
And I thought, what more could there be? He's already pulled me out. And around that time, I'm forgetting the sequence now, but the Inspector General of the State Department goes marching up to the committees that were starting this impeachment inquiry with the Rudy Giuliani file, which was, you know, all about me and the Bidens and this, that, and the other thing. And
it was an Oppo research file on you that he had sent to the Secretary of State himself.
Yeah, and everybody had sort of discounted it. But then all of a sudden, when, you know, we're getting to the boiling point in September, the Inspector General decides that he needs to share this with the committees. And I thought, what does this mean? I mean, if you actually look at the files, they are laughable. But I was not laughing because I wasn't sure what that meant.
Yeah. And
in NATO, we've made it, it's an old commitment, it's an existing commitment, and if any NATO nation comes under attack and invokes Article 5, the United States has an obligation that it will meet to join those nations in taking on the aggressor. And if that's Russia, that's what's going to happen. And that's a pretty clear red line, and one that has existed for a very long time and predates this president, and it's one I believe in and should continue. I think the likeliest thing you're going to see from Putin is trying to use chemical or biological weapons, for that matter, but doing it in a way that makes it look like someone else did it. So that's his history. For example, when chemical weapons were deployed in Syria, clearly Assad was behind it. But he spent weeks sort of building up this notion that somehow the rebels and the opposition to Assad were the ones that were going to use chemical weapons and did. And so my feeling is that that's exactly the kind of thing he would try to do here. I don't think he would himself admit that he's using these chemical weapons. I think he would want to blame that on Ukraine or NATO and say that it was them who did it. I think what's really important here is we should not be in the position of ruling out what we're going to do. We're not going to do that. We're not going to do this if he does that. I don't think we should be in a position of doing that because we don't know exactly how this is going to play out and who it's going to impact. It's possible that these kinds of attacks could very well have a direct impact on a NATO country or American personnel in the region. And then the response would be pretty clear about what we'd have to do. We'd have to go after whoever it is did that, or where they did it from.
Well, I mean, what would a potential chemical or biological weapon used look like? How would that be felt?
Well, again, going off their past history and what they've done in the past, one of the things you might see it is deployed in an urban area, and they would stage it to look like it was actually the Ukrainians who are using chemical weapons in the battlefield. Another option is a biological agent, some disease. As you've seen, they've been arguing for weeks that NATO and the United States have biochemical weapons labs inside of Ukraine. And the reason why they've been saying that for weeks, in fact for years, is because now if something happens, they're going to argue, well, that's the Ukrainians and the Americans in NATO deploying those weapons against Russian troops, and it's spread. So that's, in my view, the likeliest approach they would take. But obviously, this is a very rapidly escalating situation. So who knows which way it will twist or turn. But that's what I think you would see, given their past history and what they've sort of been setting up and what they've been saying up to this point.
Well, Senator, you've also been very concerned about cyber attacks. You talked about the threat of a cyber attack for years. Back in March of 2020, you told us that cyber warfare was the new battlefield for the 21st century. Tell me about the potential for cyber attacks on our banking, technology, energy sectors. How concerned should we be?
Well, first of all, cyber is an ongoing threat all the time. There are a bunch of cyber criminal groups out there. These are people that hack into companies, they gain accesses, and then they sell them. They sell them out there on this dark market of selling these things, and oftentimes they're offering them to countries. They're offering them to China, and they're offering them to Russia. They're offering them to North Korea, who themselves have developed these accesses. So look, it's quite possible the Chinese could do a cyber intrusion to steal things from American companies like they do every day, hoping that Russia will get blamed for it in the process. Now, that said, I would tell you that if you look at the situation today, Putin has to change the battlefield conditions at this point. He has to regain momentum, okay? He's not going to be able to do that diplomatically. He can't do that economically. And he can't do that through his conventional weaponry. His military today is stuck in a quagmire. They're stuck. They're stalled. And so how can he escalate? He has a handful of options. We talked about chemical and biological. Cyber is another option. An attack against the United States, against one of our companies. In essence, he'll have strike options before him, and they'll say, look, we have accesses to these companies, these industries. Obviously, keep an eye on our telecommunications and banking and energy, oil and gas companies, because those are the ones that would most hurt the country. That would be his equivalent of sanctions against the U.S. economy.
What's your take on this partnership between China and Russia? The White House still has what quote-unquote consequences Joe Biden put on the table for Xi Jinping during that phone call. Have you been briefed on the phone call between Joe Biden and Xi Jinping? And what are the consequences if China continues to support Russia?
First of all, that's the important thing we have to say is all this. I read some articles last week and columns about China's in a tough spot. They have to decide. China's already decided. Okay, Xi Jinping and China is 100% on Russia's side. Now they're going to try to hide it. They'd prefer not to be caught doing their view around the world, how people view them around the world, but they're 100% on Russia's side, and I understand why. Number one, they figure as long as Russia is strong or strong enough, it distracts us from focusing on China. And the second is because they view Putin and China and Russia as their co-combatants, in essence, their partners in this broader conflict against the West and the United States. And so they're 100% with them, okay? As far as buying oil and gas from them, sure. I mean, especially now that you can buy it at a discount around the world, because many oil and gas traders are reluctant to touch Russian oil and gas. I think one of the things China is going to try to do is create an alternative to the SWIFT program, to the SWIFT system, allow banking transactions to occur electronically without having to go through SWIFT. So we need to be